Hey, folks, let's talk a little bit about Mark chapters 9 and 10, just these couple of chapters here today. And even within that, just a little bit of content here today. Let's try to keep it quick. Although with me, who knows? Last time we were together in chapter 8, I was talking about this blind man that Jesus heals, where it kind of is a double healing. It takes two touches, if you will, for this blind person to see. And I suggested, I think, or if not, that it's not coincidental that comes here right before Peter's declaration that Jesus is the Messiah, which seems to us to be seen clearly. And yet we see immediately following that when Jesus predicts his death, Peter is not interested in that, and he says, Jesus, no. And Jesus rebukes Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. Right? So seeing clearly, does Peter see clearly? He sees Jesus as the Messiah. Hooray. Jesus says, I'm going to have to die. Peter says, heck no, you're not. So is he seeing clearly or isn't he? It's a yes and a no. It's both. He sees something accurately, but something else important, very inaccurately. So that's interesting. How these incidents, these stories, they kind of are one after the other here in Mark's account. Something to think about. And there's a few throughout these chapters we're looking at here. There's a few instances of this pattern of Jesus making a prediction about what's going to happen to him, followed by the disciples not getting it, followed by a teachable moment where Jesus kind of pulls them aside to show them the way that their thinking is off. That who he is. So who he is as Messiah, right? King, promised, promised King, Messiah, yes. Cross, they say no. And so it's not going to be until really Jesus's death and then resurrection that they begin to understand how these pieces come together. And I also suggested that that's perhaps the best explanation, at least that I'm aware of why this don't tell anybody stuff, this, that we see particularly prominent in Mark's account of the gospel. So we see that happening. In chapter 9, we have the transfiguration, which I don't want to talk about in detail here. Again, trying to keep this sort of quick. But this is in verse 7 of chapter 9. It's something I think really worth at some point spending some real meditation or reflection time on. It's simple, but it's profound. Then they're up on the Mount of Transfiguration. Then a cloud appeared and covered them. And this cloud, if you remember back into our Old Testament, is often associated with God's powerful presence, right? Filling the tabernacle and that sort of thing. A voice comes from the cloud. This is my son, whom I love. Now that should be familiar. Where is that familiar from? Jesus's baptism, right? This recognition of God's voice. This is my son, whom I love. But he says here, additionally, listen to him. This is interesting. This is my son whom I love. Listen to him. So there's this affirmation of who Jesus is from the voice of God in this cloud presence, right? That tends to represent God's, manifest presence, God's glory. This is my son whom I love. Listen to him. Why is that so important? Well, it's important in a big picture way, but specifically it's important for Peter and the disciples because they're following Jesus, but are they really listening to him? They're following him, but they're also fighting him in a sense. And friends, so often we can do that too. We're following him, but we're also fighting against him sometimes in the work that he's doing in our lives or the things that he's wanting to show us and teach us. We're following, if we're not careful, on our own terms rather than on his terms. And that's something that we need to be watch out for. If we're going to claim, believe that Jesus is who he says he is, that comes with it this responsibility, demand that we listen to him. And listening to him doesn't just mean hearing the words, it means following, trusting him, right? Not just trusting that he died for us, not just trusting that because of that we have eternal life, but trusting that his word is truth. Trusting that the way that he has called us to live is for our good. It's the best for us. Listen to him, is what the voice of God says to those like us who are already following Jesus, but maybe also resisting in a very serious way. So in chapter 9, verse 10, and following that section, Jesus again, he's spending some time alone here with his disciples. He's away from the crowds. And he says to them, the Son of Man, of course, that's the term that he uses for himself most often, Jesus, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. Verse 32, but they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. That's one that just in this reading, that last line is something that I underlined, that I stopped and said, wow, this is really interesting. They didn't understand what he meant, which I think is understandable. Now, from our perspective, that Jesus dying and rising, and we've had a lot of Easters, and so it's all maybe second nature to us. But for them, this was substantial stuff to process. Again, I've talked some about that along the way here. They didn't understand what he meant, and they were afraid to ask him about it. And it just sort of made me stop and sort of wonder, like, why were they afraid? Why were they afraid to ask him about it? Did anybody ever come to Jesus with sincere questions, wanting to understand where he was harsh to them? I don't know. Maybe we'll have to give some sort of thought to that. But you think that within this kind of community of discipleship, that they feel like they could ask Jesus things. Were they afraid of looking dumb because he had talked about it and they didn't understand? Was it, insecurity? Were they afraid of Jesus's reaction? It doesn't say right here in the text, but it just says that they didn't ask him because they were afraid to ask him about it. So that's really interesting. Something to think about, and maybe even again kind of meditate on, dwell on. Are there things that we are afraid to really ask, or afraid to have exposed about ourselves? I think is a pretty good question. So again, this pattern that I mentioned here in Mark's gospel, Jesus makes a prediction. We call it a passion prediction, sometimes prediction about his death and resurrection. And that's followed by the disciples not understanding. But then, and again, see how these things come together sequentially almost here. Verse 33, they came to Capernaum. That's kind of their home base. When he was in the house, he asked them, what were you talking about on the road? But they kept quiet along the way because they had argued about who was the greatest. There's a lot that can be said about this, right? But we'll call it adventurers and missing the point. So Jesus is talking about how he's going to lay down his life. And then following that, they're like, we don't understand that, but let's talk about which one of us is the greatest. And they were talking about it, and yet they didn't want to bring the conversation to him, right? They didn't want to admit to him that they were talking about that, and so they kept quiet. Right? They were not proud of this discussion. It seems like just really interesting. So human of these disciples recorded on these pages of scripture, right? So again, in this sort of pattern, Jesus makes a prediction. They don't get it. They're way off track with what they're thinking about. And Jesus says, all right, teaching moment here. Teaching moment, guys. Let's let's take a minute here aside. Verse 39, sitting down, Jesus called the 12, and he said, anyone who wants to be the first must be the very last and the servant of all. Right? Servant. We say, oh, we're talking about servant leadership. He doesn't say leadership. He says servant. Right? We still, I think, sometimes resist this. Oh, we're not servants. We're whatever. Right? I'm a pastor. I'm an elder. I'm whatever. I'm not a servant. No, you're a servant. That's the greatest in the kingdom, right? This is upside down. And sometimes if we're not careful, we can operate within the church with very worldly ways of thinking. Be very careful about that. Jesus says the greatest in the kingdom is the servant of all, the very least. Right? And Jesus exemplified that, right, in his washing of feet, in his serving, in the humble way that he lived, and his very coming to earth to become human is not a step up, right? In those circumstances, right? He takes the child as another kind of, again, example. Takes the child and placed it among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said, whoever welcomes one of these children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. Okay. So much in here. It's so good. So last thing, this was not as quick as I wanted it to be. Again, we have more about children in chapter 10, verse 13. Really interesting, challenging stuff. So in chapter 10, verse 32, Jesus predicts his death again. And my Bible even has a heading added by the editors of this particular edition, right? Jesus predicts his death a third time, verse 32 of chapter 10. When they were on their way to Jerusalem, Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. We've already had this discussion. They've not gotten it. Let's have this discussion again. We are going to Jerusalem, he said. Okay, I told you this was going to come. We were going to go to Jerusalem. That's the first step in the story that's going to lead to his crucifixion. He said, I said we're going to go to Jerusalem. Now we're actually going to Jerusalem. All right, guys? So this is no longer in the realm of think about this happening someday. That day is getting closer. So you got to be ready for what's going to happen, even though they never really were. We are going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. There's more detail. They will condemn him to death, and they will hand him over to the Gentiles, right? That's the Roman representatives, Pilate, et cetera. We see that happening. Who will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. So a lot more details here, right? It's not just going to be a death, shameful death, insult, all these things, right? Then 3 days later, he will rise. Okay, so death and resurrection, this pattern of gospel. Jesus says this is what's coming. And look at, in this account here, look at the very next verse. Guys, the Bible is not just a collection of little snippets and stories and tidbits and true sayings. This is the way that this is arranged. Mark is wanting us to understand the missing the point part, I think. Look, it's the very next verse. Jesus is saying all this stuff. I'm going to be abused. I'm going to be killed. But 3 days later, I'm going to rise again. The very next verse 39. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want to ask you for whatever we want you to do for us, whatever we ask. We want a wish. Give us a wish. And Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? They replied, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. Okay, we want to have the best seat. Remember, they were just arguing about who's the greatest. Now they're saying we want to have the best seats. And they're imagining here, they're not processing the cross. They're thinking of instead the throne, Jerusalem, David, Solomon, power, authority. We're back on top, baby. We want to be there right in those seats, Jesus. But they don't get it. They don't get it at all, really, right? You don't, verse 38, you don't know what I am. Don't you know what you were asking? Jesus said, can you drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? Okay, there's a lot of imagery there that's kind of, we're like, whatever, but he's thinking of what's going to happen next, right? Thinking of his suffering and the cross. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. Those places belong to whom they have been prepared. And then I'll finish with this, verse 41. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Doesn't say why, but look how Jesus responds again. Jesus called, verse 42. Jesus called them together. Right? We see this pattern now again and again and again happening. Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Right? You see this language here. Lord over, exercise authority over. What we have here, hierarchy. I'm on top, you're underneath. I speak, you listen. Power and authority, and let me wield my will over you. That's how it works in the world. That's still how it works in the world today. And if we're not careful, if they weren't careful, and we need to be very aware of this. If we're not careful, we're going to, under the name of Christ, operate just like the world. And that happens again and again and again. It has happened through Christian history. It still happens today. Way too often. We're going to operate just like the world does. And Jesus says, he puts his foot down right here, draws a line in the sand, and he says, no. That's not going to be the way. And so in the New Testament, throughout it starts to talk about, use different terms for the kind of responsibilities and gifts and what role functions that are given. We never have words like ruler. That's not it. That is not, and that's purposeful. Because this kingdom, this church is not about over under. When Paul speaks to overseers or elders, he'll say to those among you, right? It's not over under. Jesus is the authority. We're collectively under him, and being under him, he lays down his life for us. You see how this pattern works, this countercultural, upside down sort of pattern. And this becomes, this is Jesus. This is foundational. You want to talk about leadership or whatever else, this is the foundation. Nothing matters more than this as far as how we think about ourselves in God's kingdom, in God's world, right? Let me just read it one last time, and then I'll be done. You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Underline this, verse 43. Highlight this. Not so with you. You aren't going to do it their way. It needs to be different. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you, he doesn't say it's bad to want to be great. Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be, now we got bold language, slave of all. Wow. If we don't really spend time with this, we're going to gloss over it and say, yeah, Jesus wants us to rule nicely. No, that's not what this says. This says, if you want to be first in the kingdom, if you want God to smile with your life with favor, you understand that your identity is not pastor or whatever. servant, slave of all. Who's eligible for that category? Everybody. Everybody. Because when we understand ourselves as servants one to the other, in our marriages, in our families, in our churches, in our world, when we're saying, how can I serve you? And the other person saying, well, how can I serve you? Right? How can I help you? How can I challenge you? How can we grow together? This is how the kingdom of God works. And if we miss this, we're going to miss the reality into which Jesus is calling us. And he concludes in verse 45, for even the Son of Man, the one who has all the power and authority, Jesus, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom. That makes me emotional to think about it. It just makes me frustrated. I mean, it's hard to live into this reality in a sense. Maybe it's impossible apart from the work of God's Spirit in our lives. But if we miss this, we miss the whole thing. So yeah. Okay. Have a great day, guys. I'll catch you later.